Regardless whether the rich are trying to feed the workers cake or pink slips, one fundamental principle holds true. Capitalism will always try to exploit the workers, and the workers will always have to fight back. Because Team South Africa recognizes the continued and inherent exploitation of workers in today's world, and because we recognize that trade unions remain one of the most effective tools to fight that exploitation, we are proud to oppose the fact that they're becoming obsolete. I'm going to tell you two things in today's speech. Firstly, I'm going to engage in a ground that they've completely forgotten to touch in today's debate, which is that workers are still being exploited in the status quo. I'm then going to tell you that given this exploitation, trade unions are relevant not only because they're effective, but because besides efficacy, while their goals remain relevant, the organization will always be relevant. My second speaker, Sadia, will then tell you that regardless of my case, trade unions will always be relevant due to a perception of workers and their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Now, before I do that, I need to address some massive problems strategically and then with matter inside Proposition's case. Because firstly, they haven't told you any kind of changing dynamic in today's debate. If they wanted to tell you that these kind of unions are becoming obsolete, they had to tell you that problems were evaporating or that something was changing within unions that makes them less effective. They've completely failed to do this, right? What they have done is made a serious strategic flaw in their harms, because their harms aren't inherent to trade unions. So provided they can just bring you a list of some countries where something has gone wrong with politicization or with violence, that's not a harm to trade unions, that's not inherent. But secondly, their case is wrong even if those harms are inherent. Because if they're inherent, that doesn't prove that trade unions are becoming obsolete, it proves that we should always reject them. What they needed to show in today's debate was that for some reason, they were becoming obsolete now, that there isn't a need for them, or that for some reason they're becoming less effective. Not that trade unions are inherently broken, because then that isn't about being obsolete, that's about them being rejected overall. But now let me address an actual rebuttal to destroy their case anyway, assuming they haven't strategically gaffed this debate. The first thing they tell you is that unions force you to hire unionized workers and this breaks employment. That's not true. We think in many industries you can be hired without being unionized. We think that unions don't force this. But secondly, even if you don't unionized workers, that's not a problem because unions want more people. More people make unions powerful, it makes them rich because they get more membership fees. We see that working unions want to get as many people employed as possible because that lines up with their incentives, and thus we think even if only unionized workers can be employed, that leads to a direct incentive for more employment.
Sir.
They secondly tell you that it's hard to opt out of unions, that when the union goes on strike, people end up getting killed and beaten up because they're not going on strike there. We tell you that that's not inherent, that's a very specific case. In fact, it's a very specific case of a South African example where there isn't enough control over the violence and the way that unions do strike, and that we don't think strikes are inherently harmful in most countries. We think most workers can choose to go on strike or not. We think the unions do allow them to organize and encourage strike, which I'll be dealing with in my matter. The third thing they tell you is that unions are politicized, and that for some reason this makes them overly cautious. Are you crazy? Unions are politicized so that they can care for their workers. Their incentive is to make their workers and their members happy. What do they have to do to make them happy? They have to get effective change, higher wages and better conditions. Because they're politicized and linked to political parties, they're able to do this better, like I'll be addressing in my matter. Ladies and gentlemen, their harms don't stand and don't strategically put them in good stead in this debate. So now, first point to my substantive matter. Why there are significant problems with worker exploitation in the status quo. Here we recognize two worlds. Firstly, we look at the developing world. And here, we say it's lovely that you start off your introduction with the Industrial Revolution, because that's where the developing world is. We tell you that in these kind of countries, regulation is poorly formed, there's very often no minimum wage and no recourse for protection, but that secondly, workers are being abused by big multinational corporations. When companies have the money to bribe the government or to promise them things that makes the government just bend to whatever their will is, like new bridges and roads, we think that companies are able to do whatever they want. That's why Foxconn in China makes workers work 16 hours a day and fires them if they don't produce 2,000 iPhones within their code, even if they were just sick for one day. We think this kind of abuse is rampant and means that there is a significant need for some kind of protection. Secondly, and no thank you, in the development there is still a problem. Because we tell you that while we've got companies like Walmart and McDonald's paying workers pittance for what should be considered a relative wage within the developed world, there is a problem. We tell you that when companies are driven by profit, they've got a need to cut costs. That's what the stock market demands. That's what their investors demand. They're always going to try to pay their workers less. And this is specifically true because we're getting regressive legislation. We tell you that we're seeing the lobbies in America, which are funded by big corporates, take out laws like minimum wage, block laws to improve workers' rights because they recognize it's against their incentives. We tell you that even in the developed world, there is a need for progress. So, they're going to lose this debate because we have shown you clearly that there is a need for change, because they conceded that earlier when there was a need for change in the Industrial Revolution, unions were good. We think unions are necessary now as well. But now let me show you why actually unions are a really effective tool and thus are still very much relevant in today's debate. They've stopped offering POIs. Now what we tell you is that firstly, unions provide an organization that is unparalleled to any other type of action. Not that they've given you any alternatives in today's debate, which is another strategic flaw. I'm going to take you in a second. So we tell you that what happens with unions is workers are able to collectivize and organize. This means that not only are they able to meet and discuss their ideas, but they're able to elect leadership, which can represent them, and which can keep their views and demands constant and dynamic within the world. Yeah.
In India, unions have so much power that companies do not want to hire anybody, because if the person is incompetent, they cannot fire them due to the pressure from unions.
Great. So we think that on a comparative, that's probably better than the status quo without those unions. Because we think that it's better if workers are protected and that companies are forced to treat them better if they want to employ them. But secondly, we tell you that not every union dynamic has to be like that. That we think unions as a whole are not obsolete, because that means that we can still get effective unions doing good things. Just because there's one country with one arm is not going to win in this debate. So, they effectively organize. But secondly, they're able to effectively negotiate. Because we tell you that unions are formally recognized as representing workers. We go straight to them and they are recognized as the people with authority to talk to the workers' body. Secondly, they maintain relationships with government and business. It is a brilliant thing when you're able to have a group of individuals who are used to the system, know who to talk to, know who to negotiate with, and have a relationship with the people they're negotiating with, so they're able to reach compromises quicker. On that ground, we think we actually avoid strike action very quickly and very effectively. So we organize, we negotiate, but we also facilitate action. Because what they haven't been able to tell us is why when we need to go on strike, when we need to take companies to court, we can without unions. Unions, by collecting money from their workers and providing funds, are able to pay for things like legal action, are able to pay for things like strike funds to keep workers from starving. We would say that when we need to go on strike or take a company to court, these kind of unions are their only way. But lastly, what I'm going to tell you is that even if they're not effective, they're still relevant. And here's where we've rarely seen a failure. But provided problems are still present, provided we still need to improve workers' rights, and provided this is the goal of unions, so unions are trying to do that, it doesn't matter whether they're working or not. But provided they can change, provided they can adapt and become more effective next year or in 2 years' time, they are still relevant. While the problem they're trying to combat is relevant, the organizations trying to do it are always relevant due to the nature of adaptation and due to the inherency of the kind of problems that side propositions brought you. Because they have not done what they need to do strategically, because we've shown you workers still need protection and unions are the only way to do that, I am proud to oppose this motion.